Um, hey, so I'm Stephanie Lin, and I'm pleased to introduce the next presenter, Leah Wulfman. Leah Wulfman is a carrier bag architect, educator, game designer, digital puppeteer, and occasional writer. They're the Walter B. Sanders Fellow at the University of Michigan, where they currently teach a design studio and seminar using mixed reality technologies. Leah is a trained architect and has been assembling hybrid virtual and physical spaces in order to prototype new relationships to technology and nature, as well as challenge the normative ideologies so often reinforced by the discipline. They've produced mixed reality installations that play with and emphasize the physical material basis of everything digital. And they're presently working on a research series focused on gamified environments, interactions, and materials. Outside of Michigan, they have taught at numerous institutions in the United States, including the School of Architecture, which is where we first met. And Leah has also collaborated with Studio Elana Schlenker and LA-based artist Lauren Halsey. They have been exhibited at numerous exhibitions and festivals across the world and online. I've been looking forward to this conversation, and thank you, Leah, for presenting.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you you both so much. It's really a pleasure. So let me just, I guess, get started by sharing my screen. We'll do this dance. Can you see that? That's going through. Okay. Cool. So hi everyone. I hope everyone's doing great. And I wanted to apologize in advance for not properly queuing up my desktop. And it's really an honor to be here. And I just want to be clear that I just feel like I'm getting started on all this work that I've been working on. And I work with students all the time. I teach usually the same age as my students, you know. And I consider myself still very much a student. So it's a massive honor to be here. Stephanie mentioned, oh wait, I don't think I'm sharing audio. Can you do that? Yeah, okay. So I'm trained as an architect, but I make video games, and video games that are purposely overtly physical, material, and spatial. So the work tends to involve, say, sets, props, playful collaboration, and what I would call the purposeful misuse of state-of-the-art spatial technologies that we know as like 5G, VR, MR. We'll get into it. But the point is to push out of the screen and out of the headset and into physical space. So I think of these sets and props much more as spatial prototypes for technological realities that you can say beyond isolation, right? We're not in the headset, beyond disembodiment, beyond something which I would say is flat or without feeling, or without fun, or I would say without funk. Let's see if I can move. So Stephanie mentioned it, but my pedagogical practice and just my practice overall, I would say is predominantly geared towards experiments in mixed reality. So we're looking at here the mixed reality spectrum from Paul Milgram, 1995. So it's been around. But the point that I use for is to bridge and address what I see as kind of current vast gaps existing between design methodologies used both in physical and digital space. So we can say such that the world is increasingly mixed, right? We have such things as the metaverse. It's mixed, it's trans, and while an architect's process procedures are equally mixed, we still have this point where we have common architectural products, which are still blank models on a podium and CG renders on a wall. So this mixed reality spectrum, I just show it because it's really useful. And I don't want to take up too much space for showing the work, but it basically just describes a spectrum between physical and digital, which opens up new territory for design and experience. And this diagram, if we look on either side, you have augmented reality really just kind of puzzled in and slotted in on one extreme. You know, it's a augmented digital layer onto physical reality, virtual reality, the other extreme, completely digital world. So this diagram also reveals how our current tools, whether AR or VR, are actually quite limited and conventional if we use them as we're told, because there's all this territory in between that we have yet to really work with. So I'm going to go into the personal projects, and I call myself a carrier bag architect. That's taken from Ursula K. Le Guin, and that is that I always want to be progress and process oriented. I'm much more interested in prototypes over projects, and which is actually, all these things are kind of the reverse of the way architects typically do things. I'm much more an open source over, say, proprietary ways of working. So I'm far kind of less interested in putting me or my ego at the center of the work. Much more invested in anyone being able to engage the work and apply that learning to carry the work forward through their own means and insights. So I am interested in doing and learning together with other people. So this is a project that I did as a thesis project. This was back in 2017. And as you see here, the idea is, instead of going for a physical palm reading, say you would go of like kind of the material plane and experience, you go for a reading of your digital history. So it's a digital palm reading of sorts. And it kind of takes seriously the idea that when you're searching, say on Google, you're actually seeking answers. And you're seeking answers from the universe, just like as if you were to go to like a tarot reading or a psychic reader. So the project to some extent began for me with a question. And that question kind of became a diagram that you see at center. But the question was, what physical distance have I traveled while scrolling online, right? Like as I thumb through and traversed, with my fingertip on my smartphone, what distance have I traveled, say, if I put it into a proportion from, say, here to the moon, right? But it was really thinking about how we can start to physicalize our online experience, and kind of turn it into something that became a point of intuition versus a point of disconnect. So here I translated, as you scroll and as you zoom, it's translated into a series of swim strokes in the VR piece. So zoom, say, is a breaststroke, right? And this became a method to move and literally swim forward in space and in VR. It also was originally, that whole question became inspired by a really old short story and film that was made called The Swimmer, where he attempts to swim and connect pools through what was suburbia. So here you can kind of see the basic interaction. And the VR experience kind of begins with like an I Ching initiation process. You have like a digital presencing, right? You're looking at your hands. You can see here on the upper left, there's, phone keeps going off. But you can see there's a relationship between kind of what you're seeing and kind of what you're wearing physically, and then what happens in the digital space as well, right? The gloves of the Connect. And I'll kind of walk through kind of this smartphone Siri as your spiritual guide a little bit more. So here is also like just another part of kind of that cave space that you're wandering through, but it was kind of cool also because I had everyone from a 5-year-old to an 80-year-old. And of course, neither of those people had done VR before. And just by saying swim forward, right? Because we kind of swim, go in the direction of our movement, just by turning our head. They were able to navigate the entire thing, entire cave architecture that I had designed. So that, I always say, it's like putting my architecture skill sets to really good use. But it was really amazing to see, because usually the way we move through VR, it's all teleportation, it's this or that. It's really not intuitive. And this is a larger spatial context of the project. I wanted to think of VR as something that you went up to. It was kind of a set up experience, and literally a set where you didn't just kind of put the headset on. It was a larger spatial prolonged thing. So it starts with the fact that you actually use a cell phone to sign in and sign up for what's called an internet guided healing session. But you can think of that as almost like a mix between a medical or a therapy appointment. And then in right, you can see you actually then came in person and you logged in to your Google, like your Gmail account, at which point I was able to feed basically everything you could ever search for into the Unity game engine. And that all your searches then became kind of searchable within this digital psychic reading. And that's the tub. I'll just walk through. This is kind of like the behind the scenes, like how it was made. I was living in LA and got most of this stuff off Craigslist free. So styrofoam they use in sets. Randomly, LA has a ton of free dirt, free jacuzzis. So jacuzzis, they became central to my project. But you can also see that I found an old cell phone that I got working. And so there is even a kind of corresponding relationship between what we experience kind of as Siri as the phone speaking to us, and then how that has kind of a physical second, So yeah, basically the jacuzzi, as soon as you enter into the cave, it's literally the same width as the jacuzzi, and then you see the cell phone, but you also had seen it before kind of in person, physically in front of you. These are some kind of the digital assets that then became populated in the cave structure. So if you had, say, searched for something, that was like individualized or collective, I was able to pull kind of 3D models and those populated the cave as you went. So you saw it and it was actively dynamic. And this is just someone who had tried it. This is Theo, who's also a mixed reality artist, trained as an architect. And this is kind of like, on the upper left was a really early setup for how I kind of went through the cubes you see are kind of spatial thresholds and what are called triggers. So if I enter one, then I get to that point in the psychic reading. And then you kind of see the cave architecture snaking around. And those kind of then were spatialized, and the cave almost became almost one-to-one in relationship with what was being spoken about. So if you were, say, trending, it kind of collapsed internet terminology with the way we could think about like moving around spatially and even swimming. So streaming, trending, these kind of conversations were like made spatial.
Hello. Welcome to your internet-guided healing session. I'll be your spiritual guide through the waters of the internet. What name do you go by?
So then that person said their preferred name, or the name they want to kind of use.
Welcome, Jesse. When was the last time you were online?
And Jesse said, I was online
Begin
2 seconds
centering
ago.
your energy. I see you recently searched for Kylie Jenner underage plastic surgery Tumblr. Bring your attention to your recent search, letting it gradually come into greater focus.
So it kind of went through all these prompts. And eventually you get to a point where it becomes kind of that collectivized portion of the cave. And it's really funny because the AI that I was using, like the voice couldn't say certain things. So you heard like Kylie Jenner underage plastic surgery, it pronounced it Tumblr versus Tumblr. And so that was something that someone had searched. And then these are kind of where you have a fidget spinner got populated in this reading.
Ebb, and flow of water carries encoded messages. Understand the ripples around you and focus.
So, and that was part of a larger kind of world building project where I was just almost thinking about it as, you know, there was ritual purification wear that was built for this, right? So it was like you were almost entering like a Korean spa. You kind of put on the garb, and then you were in a completely different space. So it was that larger projected experience. And this was kind of like the inspiration. You can see kind of like the resonance with like cable porn, ritual, and even surgical wear. And then translucency, workers, clothing. And then Stephanie knows this project well. But this is a project we did in 2019 using green screen. So this is pre-Zoom, pre-OBS Grays, pre the whole architecture hype machine. It's a project called Desert.vfx. And the project, to some extent, was inspired, well, actually, to the whole extent, was inspired by a conversation I had about Grand Theft Auto. So my friend's younger cousin, he told me that his younger cousin, who was 9 years old, came through to LA, ended up giving an entire tour to the family of LA, even though he had never visited LA in person. But he had visited in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas Fault, and he was able to give a full kind of architectural and iconic tour of LA. So the project stemmed from that conversation, and we were thinking about the desert. This was from, we were commissioned through my friend Danny Will's Space Saloon. It's a design build festival. So we were thinking about the desert, and the project became almost a constant mediation of a physical location with its digital representations and all the spatial stories we tell about it. So I think of it, and you're seeing here, Mon Oncle by Jacques Tati, where, so I think of it almost as an inspiration matchup between, say, Jacques Tati and Haroun Farouki, who's Hito Cheryl's was her mentor. But my good friend Maxim and I, we basically made a series of green screen cutouts, which we then used to stitch those spatial realities that I spoke about. And these cutouts, much like Tati that we see from this kind of introduction to Mon Oncle, are playful shapes and characters that poke fun of their desert context, just the way that Tati with his characters pokes fun of modernity. And we worked with 5 people to situate them in the landscape and play around in all the ways we could. So we basically turned the desert into a set that we kind of played out. And it also stemmed from this obsession. Because we brought a lot of kind of the games from the desert into the space. And this is just an example of, in Grand Theft Auto 5, it's just kind of game ambiance where you just sit and you observe. So it almost becomes completely spatialized. And yeah, so this is like time gets compressed or protracted in game space. And here I am just experiencing the digital rain, the sound, the simulation of the machine through the windshield of the car. So I'll just go through this. Oop, let me go back. Right, so that's just like, okay, green screen shape. We filmed it so we could track it. This is it being tracked, and then thinking about it almost as like a portal. These are 3D scans from that desert location, and tons of green screen objects that we had found. So then this became the film of sorts. I'll kind of skip through and just highlight a few things. Let's see. So I became, of course, because my whole preoccupation is like the relationships between the digital and the physical kind of wind simulation that we're talking about. So the point in time where the grass moves across and flows in the breeze equally became kind of my point of obsession. This Maxim, he became a part of the entire set, and it was live painting and live getting green screen was part of that whole arrangement. So we just used like almost, it was like a bunch of techniques that we were just kind of playing around with, seeing what we could do. So it did function as a prototype, even though it became a finalized film that I show, but that wasn't necessarily always the ambition. It's just to have fun. And then this is one project that I led and taught with the first year. I ended up teaching the first year at SCI-Arc, and I led this. It was the first year, which is coordinated by Mira Henry, and she invited me to teach the final project, and I was like, that's wild, okay. But yeah, so the students over the semester had collected objects, they had collected textures, and their whole studio had mixed those things at different scales, right? So they were thinking about the model as a ready-made in the realm of the internet. And I came and I basically was just like, I'm going to have you scale these things up and thinking about the ways that we, almost like what I was doing with Desert VFX, can kind of bring those objects in to a spatial choreography where the green screen is something that's not just flat, but then becomes carried through and projected in space as objects. And then they also, so we basically spatialized the green screen set with the objects and textures that they had already collected throughout the semester. And they told the story of the collection through this green screen set. And then part of the project also, to kind of disrupt the spatial reading, it also had to do with augmented reality. So they used an avatar, they accrued those spatial, like in those same objects and textures on. It was also part of the design project to design around this avatar, but to create further ambiguity and interactivity. So this is just some of the views from the final. The final was live streamed using OBS, but this was before Zoom. This is before everything during the pandemic. And so the critics were simultaneously looking at the piece, the installation, while looking at the screen where OBS was kind of live, real-time compositing all the video content and texture content that they had worked with. And those were dynamic and changed and swapped out. So much was about kind of creating new associations between digital and physical overlays and textures and objects. So you can see here, the ring of critics that typically surrounds a project actually became actively implicated in the performance of the piece. But yeah, so there's this idea that kind of like role playing of the critic that became crystallized through this review, which I found super interesting. But you can see here, this is one installation, and the bottom right is another set of, it was teams of 5. And just more of that. You can see how it changed over time. Each project kind of had a duration to it, right? So in and of itself, the students kind of would do between 1 and 5 minutes, and it would either loop or it would end. And then you could kind of see the basic spatial setup that they had to deal with, right? Where you have on the upper right, where you have the TV screen on one end and then the green screen on the other, and then they kind of green screen all the objects in between. But what you're seeing here is it already composited. So I'll show you what it's like now. So and then the upper right, you can see it not, it's just kind of what, you know, the physical installation looked like without kind of the compositing happening live. And then you can see in the bottom right, they actually did a Super Studio inspired game, which all played with forced perspective. So that was really brilliant. And then you can see here, this is Olivia with her project. So you can see what that project was like. But they almost became, they created new types of materials that would be specific to the way that digital overlays and materials would work with them. So It was really brilliant because the way even an object collapsed in relationship to the next became a vocabulary that you could work with. And I don't want to get too far deep into this one, but I have a preoccupation with making custom controllers. And this idea is that we typically, and I'll just showcase a project that I just finished up, but I won't get so into it. We'll deal with it at a superficial level. Yeah, so typically you have a custom game and you have a generic controller. I also became really interested in people that would mod controllers, specifically because they had disabilities, so they couldn't play the game per usual. So this is the idea that you almost have a custom game and then you have a custom controller to fit that game. And there, eventually I'm almost interested in how you can have custom kind of rumbles or interaction that would associate with what happens in the game. So this is one that was just made from a field of rocks. It almost performed as a weird pedagogical experiment of just kind of finding objects in the field, and then you find the game controller. And that then stems and leads into a very recent project of mine, which I did in collaboration with Studio Elana Schlenker, where we did a publication, a game, and a custom controller, and all that experience almost became collapsed in what was, if you bought kind of the special edition of the publication, it would fit a game controller, and it fit the game itself, almost as if you were to buy kind of an old school cartridge. You opened it up from the plastic container. Even the scale of the publication was thought of in that way. And it's kind of like a console of sorts. And then it was for what's called Exchange, which is annual publication, an exhibition of student work from School of Architecture at Carnegie Mellon University. So we were hired to put this together, and the added portion was it was the first time that the school was meeting back in person. So how can you up that experience, essentially? So I'll just show some of the tidbits from that, but you can see even the scaling and sizing of the controller here ranges from something that's handheld all the way up to furniture. It has a sort of disposition. So these were like aluminum-like controllers that were all customized to fit to the game. This is in between classes, students playing the game in the space. So this is midday before they go into studio. I'll show this, where you go through, you kind of have the game menu, and I'll drop a link so you guys know where it is. But it's exchange.soa.cmu.edu. If you go there, you can download the game and play it because the exhibition's down. But you have character selection, you pick from 4 characters, then you go into a 3D space and it starts to organize the spaces of the studios. And all the studios and seminar and coursework you can kind of go into and have experience speaking to the studio ambassadors, the professors, and then going up and interacting intimately with the work itself. So these are just some previews. These are in-game screenshots. So the 3D world, we even put some of the student models in so you could game through them. And then every door became a portal to the space, the 2D space of the actual studios and seminars. And then these are just some in-game previews in editor mode, so you can kind of see even like spatially how some of these were designed. The plan, the map from above. It's almost was like chutes and ladders where different platforms allow you to kind of access different levels of work from first year to thesis. And all that kind of looped back into working with Alana, who then kind of carried the entire publication. But we basically did the graphics and everything together. And the point was is that those things were supposed to bleed, so everything almost became cohesive and fun, but still open-ended. And so students and faculty could celebrate and almost re-engage the work anew that now that we're all together in person. So it was just celebratory. That was, yeah. And thank you. And Stephanie, should I stop sharing for this? You tell me.
You can keep sharing. Yeah, that was super awesome. Thanks so much for sharing all that work. I'd seen a lot of it on your website, but it was such a treat to hear you talk about it. I know we're running out of time, so maybe I'll just ask one question that we can expand on. So I really appreciate like the continuities between the virtual and the physical, and that there's a kind of aesthetic that is attached to it. And there's also an appearance of tactility that kind of pervades all of your work, whether it's physical or virtual. It looks like something you want to grab and touch and engage with. And so the sourcing of materials seems really important. Like, how do you choose your materials to produce another materiality? How do you choose your assets? And what are the processes that you kind of come back to create this this appearance of tactility? So maybe you could speak to that. Like, what are these like value systems that are governing these decisions as you collect and source and translate?
That's a super good question. Because it oftentimes have to do with obviously things that are handmade, but even the way, I mean, I've worked with you, Stephanie, in terms of making that Shelter World project, and the handmade can be something that we just like take a VR controller and whirl it around us to make something, you know, and to make a script or like font, right? So for me, I like to think about them as much more things that are accessible, things that engage people's personal stories and histories, because that's always more potent. And of course, it builds into kind of like the whole post-commodities question, but I'm much more just like saying like, the object itself helps us learn about the world, you know. That's the whole question of architecture in and of itself to some extent, is that material has histories and that gets circulated and spatialized in certain ways, you know. So that was always my fascination with architecture in general, is just the stories that we tell in the spaces and materials. So like I'm even doing a project and I'm teaching a seminar where we go through and just look at curatorial processes around the way, what we think of as trash, right? And trash is a value system in and of itself. Like the fact that I put something up on Craigslist free, right? And like, is that considered trash? When I return something to Amazon or Home Depot, is that trash, you know? So, and when I put something in the scrapyard or in the dump, right? All these things are like accrued material, just as like they were on, say, TurboSquid, like any 3D kind of place that you would download 3D models, right? So I think it's also a question of that so many of these things are given to us as flat, right? They're kind of flat experiences. We think that there is kind of conceptually obviously a relationship between objects that we engage like IRL, as well as say download and throw away in our recycle bin. But that the interesting thing is actually the material distinction between those and the stories that each of those hold, you know, that there's a whole story to my recycle bin and the way I curate it versus the one that if I was to go to, you know, a Goodwill, like that's a whole curatorial process in itself. So I'm much more interested in like what it says about culture and what it says about kind of our personal lives in relationship with one another. So collecting is a big part of that.
Yeah. It's really interesting to think about digital trash, because I mean, we're always on, I mean, not we are always, but we're I like to browse Google Warehouse and TurboSquid as well, and you know, there's value attached to certain models over others, you know, some are free, and they all get translated into the same format, but the processes of translation are different. Like the cheap models are often like alpha channel image maps onto
very
plain.
low poly.
Yes.
Low texture, everything.
Exactly.
Totally.
And then once in a while you get lucky with a high poly free model, but that's less easy to find. So yeah, thinking about these processes of translation and how they map onto value, and then also how they constitute systems of valuation, as well as systems of discarding, needing to discard these models, or not attaching as much value to them, is really fascinating. I'd love to see what comes out of your course.
We'll do. Yeah, it's gonna be a fun project. So
Yeah,
I'm excited to share. Yeah, I'm working with a painter in New York, so he's gonna be a part of it. So I just and his daughter. So it's gonna be a larger, brilliant kind of experiment, which I'm very excited to share once it happens.
cool. Awesome. Well, I want to be sensitive to time. It's been a minute for a while, so maybe we can close out. Thank you so much, Leah.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for the invitation. And
yeah,
thanks.
of course.
So.
And we'll see you soon.
See you very soon.
Yes. Cool. Thank you so.